Questions prompted by events yesterday. One of them is how the disaster changed football and indeed how games were managed subsequently. Let's speak to Dr. David Webber, who's a specialist in the politics of football, such as they are at Warwick University. Doctor, welcome to you. How did what happened at Hillsborough change football?
Well, I think Hillsborough is a definitive moment in changing the landscape of English football, indeed world football, I think, as well. Obviously, you have the introduction of all-seater stadiums, which was brought in as a result of the Taylor inquiry, which followed the disaster. But you've also seen something of a change in attitudes towards football supporters. Football supporters before Hillsborough were all treated as potential hooligans, irrespective of their age, irrespective of their class and of their background. All supporters were treated as football hooligans. And I think it's important that those attitudes, recognising that those attitudes have changed, but they must continue to change. That the fan needs to be treated with the respect and the dignity that was not afforded to those who lost their lives and indeed the survivors of Hillsborough. It's
peculiar, David, isn't it? When you look back, I mean, in my teens, I used to go to Ellen Road a lot, watch Leeds play, stand on the Cop, and you just put up with the fact that routinely, every other week, in trying to get to the exit at the end of the match, you would be lifted off your feet and you didn't know where you'd be deposited. And that was you just accepted that if you wanted to watch your team play.
Absolutely. This is one of the incredible things about Hillsborough, is that many fans saw it coming. They said that, well, there but for the grace of God go I, because it was only because Liverpool got to the semi-final. It was only because they were allocated the Leppings Lane end. That could have happened to any fan of any club. Such was its, so familiar was it to those. I've got colleagues, I've got friends who experienced football during the 1980s, and that was just part of the process of exiting and entering terraces at the time.
A lot's been written down the years, David, hasn't it, about fencing in, fencing in fans. I was mentioning one of the guests earlier, I was actually in the main grandstand at Valley Parade in the 1980s. 50-odd people died in the fire. It was dreadful. And the only reason so many of us were able to get out of the main stand was because there were no fences at the front wall around what was called the paddock. There was a maybe, 4.5 foot high breeze block wall. If there'd been a fence, that death toll would have been very considerably higher. Obviously, there were fences at Hillsborough, and that changed that. It's difficult to get it right, isn't it?
Well, again, this kind of comes back to my earlier point about the criminalisation of fans. That fans could be just simply, well, we'll pen them in. We need to treat them effectively like animals, like cattle. And those attitudes, thankfully, changed after Hillsborough. Obviously, bringing in seated stadiums helped in that respect. Underlying both what happened at Bradford and indeed what happened at Hillsborough as well, these catastrophes were either lessened or made worse by perimeter fencing, driven by these attitudes that treated fans as hooligans.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about the politics of football and to what extent fans have sort of autonomy. I mean, there are fans, aren't there, David, who want to see a return to terracing. That's, to what extent do they have a right to demand that and get it?
I think there's a we need to be very careful when we talk about a return to terracing. What the majority of fans want is a return to safe standing. And I think there's a really crucial part in this. In fact, safe standing is actually safer than all-seater stadiums. So what safe standing does is it allows fans to stand, but because of the way in which the grounds are laid out, it means that they can do so in a much safer way than they could have done under the old terraces, where there was just the sort of the crush barriers that you would have been familiar with.
Which gave way, didn't they? I mean, there was the Ibrox. Yeah, and they gave way, didn't they? Ibrox, Glasgow, 70-odd people died. I mean, this has happened before.
Yeah, absolutely. So safe standing would negate that. We've got the technology now that could introduce safe standing if there was the desire to do so. Now, I was at the Merseyside derby last week between Liverpool and Everton. And on the Cop there, everybody stood. Even though it's an all-seater end of the ground, everybody stood throughout. But obviously, every time we scored, the crowd would go wild, and you'd see people falling over the seats in front of them. Now that's hugely dangerous. Under safe standing, that simply wouldn't happen. And I think it's important, and I think the authorities should start to listen at least to those who are calling for a much safer form of standing.
David, very good to talk to you. David's joining us there, as you can see from the signs behind him, from Warwick University. David, thanks a lot.